Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e5. Knight g1 to f3. Knight b8 to c6. Bishop f1 to b5. Pawn a7 to a6. Bishop b5 to a4. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn d2 to d4. Bishop f8 to e7. Castle kingside. Pawn e5 takes d4. Rook f1 to e1. Castle kingside. Pawn e4 to e5. Knight f6 to e8. Bishop c1 to f4. Pawn f7 to f6. Bishop a4 takes c6. Pawn d7 takes c6. Queen d1 takes d4. Queen d8 takes d4. Knight f3 takes d4. Bishop e7 to c5. Pawn c2 to c3. Pawn f6 takes e5. Bishop f4 takes e5. Knight e8 to d6. Knight b1 to d2. Bishop c8 to g4. Knight d2 to a4. Bishop c5 takes d4. Bishop e5 takes d4. Rook f8 to e8. Knight e4 to c5. Rook e8 takes e1, check. Rook a1 takes e1. Pawn b7 to b6. Knight c5 to d3. Pawn c6 to c5. Bishop d4 to e5. Rook a8 to e8. Bishop e5 to f4. Rook e8 takes e1, check. Knight d3 takes e1. King g8 to f7. Bishop f4 to e5. Pawn g7 to g5. Pawn f2 to f4. Pawn g5 takes f4. Knight e1 to f3. Bishop g4 takes f3. Pawn g2 takes f3. Knight d6 to c4. Bishop e5 takes f4. Knight c4 takes b2. Bishop f4 takes c7. Pawn b6 to b5. King g1 to f1. Knight b2 to d3. Pawn a2 to a3. King f7 to e6. King f1 to e2. Knight d3 to b2. Bishop c7 to f4. King e6 to d5. Bishop f4 to c1. Knight b2 to c4. Pawn h2 to h3. Pawn a6 to a5. King e2 to d3. Knight c4 to e5, check. King d3 to e3. Pawn h7 to h5. King e3 to e2. King d5 to c4. Pawn f3 to f4. Knight e5 to f7. King e2 to d2. King c4 to b3. King d2 to d3. Knight f7 to h6. Pawn c3 to c4. Pawn b5 takes c4, check. King d3 to e4. King b3 to c2. Bishop c1 to e3. Pawn c4 to c3. King e4 to e5. King c2 to d3. Bishop e3 to c1. Knight h6 to g4, check. Pawn h3 takes g4. Pawn h5 takes g4. Pawn f4 to f5. Pawn g4 to g3. Pawn f5 to f6. Pawn g3 to g2. Pawn f6 to f7. Pawn g2 to g1, promoting to queen. Pawn f7 to f8, promoting to queen. Queen g1 takes c1. Queen f8 to f5, check. King d3 to d2. Queen f5 to f2, check. King d2 to d1. Queen f2 to f3, check. King d1 to c2. Queen f3 to b7. Queen c1 takes a3. King e5 to f5. Queen a3 to b3. Queen b7 to e4, check. King c2 to b2. Queen e4 to e5. Pawn a5 to a4. Queen e5 takes c5. Pawn c3 to c2. Queen c5 to e5, check. King b2 to b1. Queen e5 to e4. Pawn a4 to a3. King f5 to f4. Pawn a3 to a2. King f4 to g4. Pawn a2 to a1, promoting to queen. Queen e4 to h1, check. Pawn c2 to c1, promoting to queen. Queen h1 to h7, check. Queen c1 to c2. Queen h7 to h1, check. Queen c2 to d1, check. Queen h1 takes d1, check. Queen b3 takes d1, check. King g4 to f5. Queen d1 to h5, check. King f5 to e4. Queen a1 to e5, check. King e4 to d3. Queen h5 to e2, checkmate.